Howdy folks, hope you're doing well, and welcome back to my journey across the United States, where every state has a story, and North Carolina, you might just have some of the weirdest stories in the whole USA. Writing this, I just heard about everything from the origin of the term Hootin Annie, to a place where the devil supposedly paces at night, planning his horrible misdeeds. And between all of this, you've got some more crazy stories hanging out. I'm excited to share this lore with y'all, and clearly, you in North Carolina, you don't do boring. Now, before we jump into this story, I have a quick favor to ask of you. If you enjoy these deep dives into America's strangest tales, dropping a comment and a like and hitting that subscribe button like it just dissed Cheerwine will help me out more than anything as I try to hit my goal of 100,000 subscribers in 2025. We're almost there, and it would seriously be a dream come true to see that number. Anyways, with that, let's get into North Carolina's weird folklore. Folks, if you've followed this channel for a while, you already know. The only crypto scams we run around here are about cryptids, and today we're diving back into one of North Carolina's weirdest and most enduring legends, the Beast of Bladenboro. Now, I have covered this one before in a previous video, but honestly, every time I come back to it, I seem to find something new, so I figured why not give it another look, because this one's a bit special. So let's set the scene for y'all. Bladenboro is a small community nestled in the pine forests and swampy terrain of southeastern North Carolina, kind of right on the edge of the Piedmont. Not exactly where you'd expect to find one of America's most fun monster stories to come from. And yet, that's exactly what happened. With a population of only about 1,700 people, Bladenboro might not look like much today, but once upon a time it had a pretty bustling turpentine economy. Yes, the pungent, flammable stuff distilled from pine resin. That industry's long gone, but the town still holds on to a very different kind of legacy. This story starts just after Christmas on December 29th of 1953. That's when a woman in Clarkton, about 7 or 8 miles from Bladenboro, heard her neighbor's dog barking, whining, and clearly making noises like it was panicked. When she went outside to investigate, she saw something bolt off into the distance. She described it as cat-like, but much larger. This may have been the first sighting of what came to be known as the Beast of Bladenboro. Then came New Year's Eve, December 31st. Bladenboro's police chief, Roy Fors, got a call to come out to a local farm, one owned by a man named Woody Storm. 2 of Storm's dogs had apparently been attacked by something big, really big. One of the dogs was apparently completely drained of blood, too. According to the report, the creature had attacked one dog, left, and then came back for the other. Pretty much immediately, that was when people realized that this wasn't just any old wild animal. It was something a bit more fierce. That same day, a man named D.G. Pate also reported seeing a large creature drag a dog off into the woods. The stories started pouring in following this, reports of a panther-like animal, or maybe even a bear, or sometimes something in between. People said it was about 3 to 7 feet long, stood 20 inches high, and weighed about 150 pounds, and it had a long tail, the face of a cat, and a scream like, I quote, "a woman with a knife stuck in her back," which, yeah, that's horrifying, and it sounds a whole lot like an exaggerated mountain lion or panther, a sort of creature that lots of you folks say are absolutely roaming the southeast. The attacks didn't stop there either. Over the next several days, at least 5 more dogs were mauled or taken out. Some were part of packs, dogs that should have been able to defend one another, but the so-called beast won every time. By January 1st, the bodies of 2 more were found, and again, these dogs were drained of blood. That's when local authorities called in the professionals. Hunters from Wilmington were hired to take the thing down, and these guys, they did find something. They found tracks, footprints the size of silver dollars, roughly bobcat-sized, sure, but given the carnage, no one was buying that it was just a bobcat. And it wasn't just dogs. A pet rabbit was also attacked, and a pet goat too, whose head, according to witnesses, was pretty much flattened. Also, the stories kept escalating. For instance, on January 3rd, another dog was attacked. This time they performed an autopsy, which is interesting and okay. While this autopsy report came from the mayor, who we'll see in a second, is dubious at best, they claimed that there were, I quote, "no more than 3 drops of blood left in this dog." 2 days later, January 5th, things went up a notch, because this time it wasn't an animal that got attacked, it was a person. The Raleigh News and Observer ran a story titled "Vampire Charges Woman." In it, they described how a large cat-like creature lunged at Miss C.E. Kinlaw near the Bladenboro Mills area along Highway 211, about a mile west of town. She'd been drawn outside by the sounds of a dog whining in the street, only to find herself face to face with a mountain lion-like beast. Her screams and her husband running outside to her scared it off though, and thankfully, it darted back into the swamp, unable to add her to its proverbial hit list. At that point, things got serious. The town wasn't dealing with folklore anymore. They were dealing with a creature that was bold enough to charge a human. This, of course, led to the town taking action. Between January 5th and 7th, a full-on armed posse formed. Between 500 and 1,000 people, if you believe the legends, with their dogs, started patrolling the streets at night. People came from as far away as Tennessee to hunt this thing. Even a fraternity from UNC Chapel Hill showed up, hoping to be the ones to end the beast. Hunters used tracking tactics, set up bait dogs, and some even claimed to hear the beast nearby during night patrols. Reports during these hunts said the creature had sharp claws, clearly weighed 80 to 90 pounds, so I suppose a downside from the original reports, and may have even had offspring. Some folks even saw 2 sets of prints, hinting that maybe there was a mating pair out prowling the area. A young boy even encountered the beast and described it afterwards as a big cat that made sounds like a crying baby. Meanwhile, those not in the hunt were terrified. When the sun went down, people locked their doors. If you had to use the outhouse, well, you'd better be quick. Eventually, the panic reached a breaking point. People were getting jumpy. Law enforcement also began to worry that someone was going to mistake a fellow hunter for the beast and start shooting. Then, on January 13th, 2 things happened that brought the saga to a close. First, a local farmer trapped a suspiciously large bobcat. He brought it into town and hung it from a flagpole in the Bladenboro town square, and posted a sign saying, "This is the Beast of Bladenboro." And whether or not the bobcat was truly the Beast of Bladenboro, it worked. The mass hysteria cooled down, and people stopped patrolling in armed mobs. Reports of the beast attacks stopped altogether, too. Also, for the record, the beast was not 100 plus pounds. It was a measly 25-pound bobcat that was described as scrappy. And I guess for what it's worth, the attacks immediately stopped after this poor little dude was caught and strung up in town. As the legend goes, that little bobcat really was the Beast of Bladenboro. Now, as for what really happened, well, that's hard to say. There's no doubt something was attacking animals. That part's decently documented, assuming the original reports of a creature attacking dogs were actually true. But there's also no denying that the whole thing got hyped up, probably more than it deserved. And much of that hype came from Bladenboro's own mayor, Woodrow Bob Fussell, who just happened to own the town's movie theater. He's also the one who called the newspapers, and the one who organized the hunting parties, and right at the height of the hysteria, he happened to screen a horror movie called The Big Cat at his theater, plastering the marquee with, "Now you can see the cat. We've got him on our screen in Technicolor." Also, while I'm sure this might have been a coincidence, marketing gimmicks like this were common in the 50s. I've come across at least a couple of stories of theaters posting up ambulances outside when there were horror movies to make their movies seem extra scary, for instance. Later, he even admitted in an interview the beast was 10% real and 90% imagination, following the statement up by saying a little publicity never hurt a small town. In the end, supposedly 8 dog attacks were officially attributed to the creature, though I'm wondering if all or any of them were real after hearing the mayor's antics. The alleged culprit, though, it remains that same little bobcat, the one with silver dollar paws and a mean streak. Most locals agreed it matched the description of what they saw roaming about. And whether it really was the beast or just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, its passing brought peace to the town. But the legend didn't entirely die, that's all we know for sure. Because of that, today, Bladensboro still remembers. Every October, the town hosts the Beast Fest, where there's food, stories, and celebration of local folklore. The Beast of Bladensboro, or Bob as the mascot's known, now lives on not in fear, but in fun. And I've got to admit, it's pretty fishy to me that a bobcat and the mayor went by the same name in the end. But hey, what do I know? I'm just a YouTuber. Who knows? Maybe it's still out there waiting to resurface someday to show the world old Mayor Bob was right after all. In the woods of Chatham County, North Carolina, in the small city of Bear Creek, and far away from even a modest-sized city, and resting on private property as well, you should note that, there's a narrow path devoid of vegetation which, at the end, houses a notorious bear circle in the ground that's about 40 feet in diameter that's been the subject of local folklore for decades. As the dubious legends go, they say that the devil himself actually tramps within this circle on certain nights, pondering how he's going to afflict the world on behalf of the forces of evil. Inside of the circle, there's some very short grass, but in the middle, nothing will grow, nor can any plant life be found on the path leading to the circle. That's a fact. The soil there, too, is somewhat blackened, which is to say it looks like campfires have been held inside of it. Even stranger, if you try to take the short grass that's inside of this circle and grow it elsewhere, it won't take to the soil, at least if you believe the legend. Furthermore, locals have a habit of testing this circle. They say that if you leave anything inside of the circle at night, for instance, if you jam a stick into the ground in this circle, the following morning you will always find that this stick has been tossed outside of the boundaries of the circle. They owe this to the fact that the devil, while tramping, doesn't like to trip over the objects left behind in the circle, and he'll angrily throw them out of the circle's bounds. Also, if you brought a dog, the story goes that it won't want anything to do with the circle, and it won't enter it. This story extends to wild dogs too, coyotes and such, that have apparently been avoiding this place since before human memory. Of course, all of this lore hasn't stopped folks from visiting this storied spot. Folks have been bold enough to spend the night outside of the boundaries, camping and such. It's said that they've been witness to very strange events. To be clear, reading up on these events doesn't yield too much, but folks with cameras aimed to their faces, and people remarking how scary it is when they hear foliage shifting around the woods beyond them, which, come on, it's North Carolina. There are deer, raccoons, bears, and about everything else you could think of prowling in the woods around here, so this shouldn't be too surprising that there's something in the woods. As for the supposed explanations for this legend, there are two camps, reasonable and legendary. In the legendary camp, folks tell a few stories. The most popular, of course, involves Native Americans, and claims that native tribes, after successful harvests, had celebrations here, and the modern-day tramping ground is where the native people danced, killing the vegetation and leaving behind a patch of dead grass. There's also a darker version of this legend that says that two tribes of native people met at the tramping ground and a battle took place, with the Indian chief Hootin being killed and buried where the tramping ground remains today. Admittedly, though, it's pretty easy to find that Chief Hootin died on Roanoke Island during a scuffle with the English, and a man named Edward Nugent is actually the one that shot him. But hey, why should you expect people with access to the entire history of mankind on the internet to be able to do their research about this? This is definitely excusable. More reasonable explanations conversely suggest that horses used to walk in circles here during the operation of an old molasses mill that was on this spot. Though, to be clear, there were lots of these, and they haven't taken the form of tramping grounds across the world. More likely is that the soil doesn't allow vegetation to take because it's been sampled and it has an extremely high salt content. This might sound crazy, but yes, it's thought that it might be the remains of an ancient natural salt lick. Crazy sounding or not, these natural salt licks were actually pretty common in North America. I mean, you need look no further than Nashville, whose original name was French Lick, referencing the local hunters who would come for deer in the area that were attracted to the local natural salt lick, and the many other nearby communities named French Lick, such as one in Indiana. Also, the soil here really is saltier than normal. This was actually looked into by the North Carolina Department of Agriculture. So anyways, what do you think? Do you propose that the devil himself plants himself in this vegetation bear circle in North Carolina, or do you think there are more natural explanations? Let me know in the comments below. Alright, now we're on to new stuff. So you've possibly heard the folk ballad Tom Dula, especially the 1958 hit by the Kingston Trio. It tells the mournful tale of a man hanged for killing a girl named Laura Foster. But behind the melody, there's a real story, and it's a tangled mess of war, romance, jealousy, and murder. So with this song in mind, let's ask the question. In reality, who was Tom Dula, or Dooley, and what really happened in the hills of North Carolina in 1866 when this story took place? Let's separate the facts from the folklore. To start the story, once upon a time, deep in the North Carolina hills, there lived a Confederate soldier and well-known ladies' man named Tom Dula. that was pronounced Dooley because Appalachian dialect doesn't really care about your spelling. Tom grew up poor, and according to legend, he fiddled his way into the local hearts, especially one of a woman named Anne, and then he marched off to the Civil War like half the boys in the county. He came back with battle scars, some more musical skills, and a very complicated love life, though. Now enters Anne Foster, Tom's on-again, off-again lover since childhood. Now, despite being on and off with Tom, she married a local cobbler named James Melton about 3 years before the war, but that didn't seem to stop her from rekindling things with Tom when he returned. Or, from my understanding, philandering with him prior to the war, too. She wasn't the only woman in the picture either. Tom had apparently taken it up with Laura Foster, Anne's younger cousin. She was pretty sweet and possibly also recently pregnant. Oh, and then there was Pauline Foster, another cousin, who may have spread more than rumors, like diseases that start with Sif and end with Illis. And if you're thinking, this sounds like a soap opera set in the Blue Ridge Mountains, I'm thinking the same thing, trust me. In May of 1866, Laura Foster saddled up her daddy's horse and rode out to meet Tom. The plan this fateful day, if you believe the stories, was elopement. Or so the story goes. But Laura never made it down the aisle. In fact, she never even made it home. Weeks later, her body, lacking her soul, was found in a shallow grave, legs folded awkwardly to fit, with a single wound to the chest. All fingers, of course, pointed to Tom, except maybe they should have pointed at Anne. We'll get to that in a second. Witnesses, of course, were quick to blame Tom, and they said that Tom believed Laura had given him that sif that ends with Illis, which he passed to Anne. Some even said that Tom mentioned he was going to do Laura in. Of course, that was hearsay. But regardless, I mean, that's the base state for most investigations of foul play, right? First, before anything else, you tend to blame the lover. It makes sense, right? Well, maybe not in this case. See, to start, records suggest that it wasn't even Laura who gave everyone here the clap, or the pock as they used to call it. It was probably actually Pauline, the third woman in this picture. Not that anyone really knew what had gone on in this love triangle or square in the first place. There's also the curious fact that Anne actually did something that's pretty suspicious for someone that's supposedly innocent. Anne, you know, the supposedly innocent party here, led authorities right to Laura's grave. She knew where it was, and supposedly took Pauline to it one night to, I quote, check on it beforehand. This fact, which was made known by Pauline, had murderer written all over it. But for some reason, back in the late 1800s, this didn't click with the local authorities. Tom, perhaps sensing that things were not going to go his way when literally leading police to the body didn't indicate Anne's guilt to them, skipped town and hightailed it to Tennessee, going under the alias Tom Hall. Here, he briefly worked for Colonel James Grayson, a man who later tipped off authorities to the whereabouts of old Dooley and helped authorities nab him. I should note, some ballads that tell this tale would later spin a yarn that Grayson and Tom were love rivals. They weren't, though, and Grayson didn't even know Laura. Meanwhile, after being arrested, former Governor Zebulon Vance, which is totally the name of some alien overlord that invades Earth in the future, and who was one of Dula's Civil War buddies, would represent him for free. During the trial, and through to the end of his life, Dula, or Dooley, would tout that he was innocent. But despite these pleas, and the fact that the trial was moved to a neutral location, Dula was convicted twice by two separate juries. Eventually, on May 1st of 1868, Tom would be hanged for these crimes. Right before the news snapped, he said in a semi-iconic statement, "Gentlemen, I did not harm a single hair on that fair lady's head." Yeah, cryptic stuff. Regardless, they say that Anne, who most certainly knew more than she let on, didn't necessarily rest easy after Tom passed away. Folks say that as Anne lay dying years later, she saw black cats crawling on her walls and smelled bacon frying, which may have just been North Carolina brunch, not necessarily damnation. Some even say she confessed to the murder. Others say she never said a word. Either way, she died without ever being charged, and whatever folks say happened is simply folklore. Myths about the case exploded after a folk ballad started making the rounds. You know it as Tom Dooley. The version that went viral in 1958, courtesy of the Kingston Trio, was lifted from folk archives without credit, though. A court later ruled that Frank Prophet, a North Carolinian who learned it from his aunt, who knew Tom, Anne, and Laura, deserved royalties. Finally, at least there was justice for someone here. And as for who actually killed Laura, well, that's still up for debate. But the top suspects are pretty obvious, ranging from Anne at the top of the list to Pauline at the bottom, with some theories involving all three as accomplices. Regardless, the jury of public opinion these days lands firmly on Ann being the one at fault. This is perhaps best shown in that Wilkes County, North Carolina has acquitted Tom post-mortem and posthumously pardoned him for these crimes. I get this doesn't necessarily unhang him, but the sign of respect is at least a nice touch. The only thing that's for certain is Tom Dula may have died by the rope, but he lives on in song, scandal, and in Southern legend. It all started with a strange, unsettling tale of a man named Eugene the Mummy. The story was so bizarre, so grotesque, that it stuck with me long after I had shared it in my very first Weird Folklore video. Eugene, you see, had been put on display in the mid-1900s when no one could identify him. They embalmed his body and turned it into a morbid sideshow, and I honestly thought that was a one-off, a freak accident. I thought I had seen the worst of it, the only instance of a body being displayed publicly rather than buried when it really should have been buried. Oh, how naive I was. As it turned out, you can do a whole lot with a body in this country, more than I ever imagined was legal. And as strange as it sounds, it happened again, right here in North Carolina. This time the story involved a man named Frenzio Concipio, though to be fair, he went by several names. The most infamous of these was Cancetto Spaghetti Farmica, and you'll understand why they called him Spaghetti in just a minute. But for now, let's start from the beginning. Frenzio Concipio was an Italian immigrant who worked as a musician in a carnival. It was April 28th of 1911 when he found himself at this carnival just over the border in McCall, South Carolina. For reasons that are still unclear, Concipio got into a heated argument with a colleague, a man not known for his civility, and the story goes that in the heat of the argument, the colleague struck Concipio in the head with a tent stake. The blow was fatal. Concipio was rushed to the hospital in Laurinburg, but despite the doctor's best efforts, he passed away. His body was then transferred to the McDougald Funeral Home in Scotland County, North Carolina, where the real weirdness begins. As the story goes, Concipio was embalmed. As anybody would be under such circumstances, the authorities contacted his next of kin, and allegedly a man who claimed to be Concipio's father showed up to the funeral home. This mystery man paid for the embalming and burial services, but after the initial payment, he vanished. No one ever heard from him again. And as a result, Concipio's body wasn't buried. It stayed here, in the McDougald Funeral Home, for a full 61 years. But here's the thing, this wasn't just some corpse sitting quietly in a back room. Concipio was put on display for the entire world to see. The locals didn't just call him Frenzio or Concipio either. No, they called him Spaghetti, a name that seems to stick to this day. Concipio's embalmed remains were placed in a coffin with a glass front, propped up in display in the garage of the funeral home. He was dressed only in a loincloth, and if that wasn't weird enough, there were 2 embalmed human fetuses placed beside him. Also, fun fact, to this day no one knows where those fetuses came from. No one even knows if they were part of the same macabre collection or if they were something else entirely. Regardless, the combination of Concipio, the fetuses, and the general grotesqueness of it all attracted quite a bit of attention. At first, I'll admit, people seemed to be fascinated in the media. And to be clear, I guess this checks out, because while we paint people of the past in a very conservative light, they had quite a bit of morbid curiosity about them. Regardless, over time this would change, word would spread, and complaints would begin to pour in. People, of course, found it disrespectful, and others were outraged by the blatant insult to Italian Americans, especially with the nickname Spaghetti being used so casually. Even more high-profile figures, like a Democratic representative from New York and a Republican representative from North Carolina, chimed in denouncing the display. Thus, pressure finally mounted on the funeral home, and in 1972 the director was practically forced to act. But in a typical macabre fashion, the funeral home wouldn't let Concipio go that easily. They said, sure, we'll bury him, but we want full payment for the 61 years of storage, embalming, and care that they'd provided, an amount that in 1972 was about $5,000, which, adjusted for inflation, that would be about $40,000 today. Now, despite the mounting pressure and public outcry, the funeral home wasn't in any rush to bury the man. Even after being removed from public display, Concipio remained in limbo. Their funeral home had become so accustomed to using him as a bizarre advertisement for their services that they turned down multiple offers. For instance, in 1939 previously, from the Italian government, who offered $500 to have Concipio properly buried. The funeral home, it seems, didn't want to lose their grim curiosity piece. But eventually, something had to give in. On September 30th, 1972, a group of local citizens, tired of the scandal, pooled their money together and arranged for Concipio's burial. His body was placed in a vault, and 2 tons of cement were poured over it, just in case someone might get the idea to dig him up. Now, to be completely clear, it's worth noting that McDougald Funeral Home is still in operation today, and it's located in the same red brick building in Laurinburg, North Carolina, where it ran the business all those years ago. Though I should be clear, the McDougald family sold the funeral home. The people who own it now run it by the same name, but they are not the same people that did all of this to Concipio. My impression is that they're trying to distance themselves from this grim past, and thus you won't find anything about Concipio's story on their website or anything. They're pretty much doing everything right, so please don't take this grim past out on them. Regardless, the story of Ferenzio Concipio, the Italian carnival musician whose body became a sideshow attraction for 61 years, lingers. It's a dark and kind of eerily fun chapter in local history that I don't think people are going to forget anytime soon. On February 25th of 1884, Kit Lassiter, a woman described by her neighbors as, I quote, noted for her truthfulness, was walking home through the quiet roads of New Hope Township in Chatham County, North Carolina. It was a calm day. The sky overhead was clear, blue and wide, and there wasn't a single cloud in sight. But then Kit heard something odd, a soft pattering, like rain. That alone didn't make sense. The air was still, the sky was cloudless, and yet something was falling. As she moved closer to where the sound seemed to be coming from, she saw droplets hitting the earth, but they didn't look right. They were too dark, too thick, and when she bent down and saw what was pooling on the ground, the truth hit her with a jolt. It wasn't rain, it was blood. Not just a few drops either. The blood had fallen in a wide area around her, not on her, almost like it was deliberately avoiding her. According to her, it formed a rough circle that extended about 30 feet in every direction. She stood untouched in the center while everything around her was speckled with red. Shaken, of course, she rushed to tell her neighbors, and naturally they were a bit skeptical, until they came to the site themselves and saw the dark stains on the soil. Someone eventually collected a sample of the blood-streaked sand and sent it off to Dr. F.P. Venable, a chemistry professor at the University of North Carolina. Dr. Venable received the sample, examined it, and was so intrigued by the story that he traveled to the site in person. It was about 2 weeks later. By then, most of the blood had vanished, either dried into the dirt or washed away. But he still found a few dark red drops clinging to a wooden fence nearby. Based on how the remaining blood was arranged, he noted that strong winds had likely been blowing from the south during their incident. He also met Kit Lassiter, who told him plainly that she believed what she saw was a sign of evil. Given the circumstances, it's pretty hard to blame her. Dr. Venable measured the area. He concluded the stain wasn't a perfect circle, as Kit had described, but it was more of a rectangle, about 50 feet by 70 feet, and the blood drops, he noted, varied in size, from tiny dots to the size of a human finger. He tested the samples in his lab, and his conclusion was it was, without question, real blood. But from what? Now, he couldn't say. There was no carcass, no tracks, no clear sign of any animal being killed here. He did float a theory, though, that maybe a bird of prey had been carrying a bleeding animal through the sky and accidentally dropped it midair. But even that doesn't feel satisfying. There was too much blood, and it was too evenly distributed. If this was a hoax, he wrote, it was done cleverly. But he didn't think it was a hoax. There was, I quote, an object lacking, he said, something that might explain the blood's presence. And he believed the event was worth reporting. No official explanation was ever found. Over the years, similar stories have surfaced, though. Strange rains of blood, or meat, or other inexplicable matters. Even Homer's Iliad describes blood falling from the sky as an omen of doom, and in modern times we've found that some so-called blood rains were actually caused by Trentepolia annulata, a type of microorganism that, when airborne and deposited by rain, can make the water appear red. But here's the catch. The algae doesn't quite look like blood when it grows, more orange than crimson, and typically it affects smaller areas, not really rectangles nearly the size of a basketball court. So could Kit Lassiter have been mistaken? Possibly. Could it have been algae? Maybe. But if so, it fooled not only her, but her neighbors, and a seasoned professor. So maybe it's worth considering something truly bizarre could have happened this day. It was a clear sky day, there was a quiet road nearby, and somehow a circle of blood fell out of nowhere, and this poor woman was left standing at the center of it. Alright, bear with me here. I have to preface this story with the fact that I wrote it up a while ago, and it doesn't necessarily involve any specific state. But given Pepsi, the giant American company that sells sody pop, was founded in North Carolina in New Bern in 1893, I'm calling this a fun bit of bonus lore related to your state. Now, with that said, let me take you on a trip back to 1989. If you were feeling curious and decided to look up who had the largest navies in the world then, you'd probably expect to find a few giants, like, the United States or China or maybe even Russia. But if you scrolled down the list, coming in 6th place, just after China's navy, you'd technically, and keep in mind this is just a technicality, find something utterly bizarre: Pepsi Cola. Yes, you read that right. Pepsi somehow owned one of the world's largest fleets of naval vessels. So this is a joke, right? I'm just lying to you, right? Well, no, not quite. Pepsi actually owned 17 submarines, a cruiser, a frigate, and a destroyer. That's right, Pepsi had a whole military fleet just very briefly in the late 80s. So how did this all happen? It's a story that's pretty strange, so strange you could barely make it up if you tried. This bizarre sequence of events that would lead to Pepsi owning a fleet of naval vessels began way back in 1959, if you can believe it, during the height of the Cold War. At this point, the US and the USSR were looking for ways to compete with one another, and one of the most unexpected ways to do so was through a cultural exchange program. Each country would showcase their achievements and their way of life to one another, as if to say, look how great we are. In the US exhibition in Moscow, for instance, they had a model American house to demonstrate suburban living. It was a big deal, and none other than Richard Nixon himself had a chance to debate Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev about the merits of capitalism versus communism in this mock-up home. And here's where it gets interesting. In this exhibit, there was a Pepsi vending machine, and Nixon, being the shrewd politician that he was, offered Khrushchev a cold Pepsi. Khrushchev, surprisingly, accepted, and to all of our surprise, the Soviet leader was impressed with the beverage, so impressed in fact that he asked for a second one. In an era where Soviet leaders were pretty much expected to reject anything remotely American, this moment was groundbreaking. It was a sign of diplomacy, even if in a small, unexpected way. Pepsi, of course, seized this rare opportunity with both hands upon noticing it. They immediately used this moment to market their product and began eyeing the Soviet Union as a potential consumer base, one that, at the time, no American company had any real access to. By 1972, Pepsi had become the first foreign consumer product allowed to be sold in the USSR. It was a huge breakthrough, but there was one significant problem. Pepsi couldn't take Soviet rubles. The Soviet ruble was a closed currency, meaning you couldn't convert it to something usable outside of the USSR. But Pepsi wasn't about to give up so easily. They came up with a clever workaround. Instead of accepting rubles, Pepsi started taking Stolychnia vodka as payment. And why vodka? Well, Stolychnia was a well-known Russian product, and Pepsi could easily sell it abroad, acting almost like a proxy seller. This trade worked out pretty well for them, but in 1989, the US government imposed sanctions on Soviet products, including vodka, and suddenly Pepsi was back to square one. With their contract about to expire and no real way to continue the vodka exchange, Pepsi needed a solution fast. The Soviets, meanwhile, still really wanted that sweet Pepsi syrup. Enter an absurd solution that sounds like something out of a Cold War spy novel. Khrushchev personally met with Pepsi's CEO, Donald Kindle, and in a twist no one really could have predicted, Khrushchev made Pepsi an offer. Instead of rubles, instead of vodka, the Soviet Union would trade naval vessels. Specifically, Pepsi was offered 17 submarines, a cruiser, a frigate, and a destroyer. More naval firepower than even Australia had at the time. Now, Pepsi suddenly found itself extremely briefly in possession of one of the largest naval fleets in the world, albeit there were caveats to this. See, Pepsi didn't actually take possession of the ships. Instead, a Norwegian shipping company brokered the deal, and Pepsi took 25% of the sale price as payment. These ships weren't exactly combat-ready either. They'd been out of commission for years, requiring significant maintenance. Still, Pepsi technically owned these warships, if only for a moment. Sadly, the ships themselves never actually sailed under Pepsi's banner, as awesome as that would have been. Instead, they were quickly sold off to a Swedish company for scrap metal. The deal didn't result in a Pepsi naval invasion of Atlanta or anything dramatic like that. But still, it's hard to deny the absurdity of it all. In the end, Pepsi came out ahead on this deal, making money on the sale and coming $3 million ahead of their anticipated profits on the sale of the ship for scrap metal too. Also, they never had to worry about maintaining submarines or getting involved in naval warfare. But for a short time, Pepsi did indeed have a navy, a fleet, a military force, even if it was one that mostly existed on paper and mostly for marketing purposes. So there you have it. From soda to submarines, Pepsi's bizarre journey into briefly sort of being a naval power is a story that'll make you think twice about the drink in your hand next time you pop open a can. I probably should have covered this in my video on the folklore of the Smoky Mountains, but hey, better late than never. Tucked away in the lush, mist-veiled valleys and jagged peaks of the southern Appalachian Mountains, there's a legend that has quietly endured, whispered around campfires and creek beds, passed down with every owl's cry in the night. In the Smokies, there's an old folk tale. If you ever get the feeling that someone is watching you, if you feel eyes you can't see, or catch a flash of something large, fast, and gray darting around in the corner of your vision, well, you might have just seen a creature known as a Boojum. See, back in the day in the early 1900s, reports of something strange started drifting down from the mountains. Something big, something wild, something not quite human, and of course, as I said, they called this the Boojum. This creature was a curious creature, described much like the wood boogers of Shenandoah. Towering and nearly 8 feet tall, his body is cloaked in thick, shaggy gray fur, but unlike the monstrous figure you might associate with that kind of build, the Boojum's face is said to be eerily human, thoughtful, almost sorrowful, and while he might be huge, he's elusive, slipping away like smoke through trees before most can catch a proper glimpse. Folks who see him are usually those brave enough to climb the mountain summits, places with wide, sweeping views. Up there, they can sometimes spy a Boojum, wandering the ridgelines before he has time to vanish. He's most often seen in the Balsam Mountains, a beautiful range near the Blue Ridge. The Boojum has become tied to the very character of those peaks. Cold Mountain, Shining Rock, Richland Balsam, Black Balsam Knob, they're all places where stories of the Boojum seem to gather like clouds. But for all of his size and strangeness, the Boojum isn't some terrible monster. In fact, the old tales actually say he's rather gentle. He doesn't lash out, he doesn't harm anyone. More often than not, you don't see him, you hear him. A long hollow call echoing from the woods at night. Something sort of like an ape or an owl, reverberating across the ridges and valleys. That said, there are two things the Boojum was said to be especially fond of. Beautiful gemstones and pretty women. A strange mix to be sure, but part of what makes him so unforgettable. See, women, they used to bathe in the cool mountain streams near these peaks, and every so often one would feel the uncanny sensation, the presence, looking at them. Looking up, they'd spot the Boojum, peeking out from behind a tree or a rhododendron bush, watching. Often startled, the women would scream, grab their clothing, and run after him in a fit of fury. And without fail, the Boojum would vanish. These incidents sparked more than a few angry search parties, groups of men tromping into the woods to find the thing that had been spying on their wives or daughters. But of course, they never found him. Some say the Boojum made his home in the caves scattered throughout the balsams. According to local lore, if you wander into one of these caves and you come across a stash of raw glittering gemstones, rubies, emeralds, amethysts, etc., you might have stumbled into the Boojum's lair. The funny thing about this, though, is he doesn't just hoard these gems in some dusty corner of the cave. He keeps them inside of jugs of moonshine. Because of this, mounted men would sometimes find these strange containers tucked into the rocks, and faced with a choice of pouring out the shine to nab the gems or having a good swig, they almost always chose the latter. 1 sips, 2 sips, and after 3, they'd be out cold. The Boojum, of course, would return, collect his gems, and then leave them in to their hangovers, never laying a finger on them, just a little poetic justice from the mountains. But no part of the Boojum legend is more enduring or more peculiar than the tale of Annie. Now, depending on who's telling it, Annie was either a local girl or a traveler, staying at the famous Eagle Nest Hotel, perched atop North Eagle Nest Mountain. Built in 1900, this hotel saw its fair share of stories, but none quite like this. See, it said that one day Anne left the hotel and was bathing in the mountain stream, and just like so many others, she felt eyes on her. But instead of running away when she spotted the Boojum, she looked into his sad, lonely face, and she felt something. Something strange, something akin to affection. Somehow, now don't think too hard about the logistics here, please, Annie and the Boojum fell in love. She left her home and family to go live with him deep in the Balsam Mountains. And the story doesn't end there. The Boojum, of course, would continue to leave their hidden den to search for gems, leaving Annie behind, and Annie would grow lonely. So she'd start walking through the woods, calling out to the Boojum, not in words, but in a sound like an owl's hoot. The Boojum would hear her and call back. Back and forth they'd go, hooting at each other like a pair of night birds, until they found each other again. Now here's the kicker. This call and response, this eerie duet echoing through the valleys, is said by some to be the origin of the term Hootin Annie, originally meant to describe a southern gathering or party. The term may have been inspired by the supposed strange love calls of Annie and her wild mountain man. It's said that these cries could still be heard into the 1940s, and sometimes even now. In 1918, the Eagle Nest Hotel sadly burnt to the ground, but even without that landmark, the legend lives on. These days, folks in western North Carolina still talk about the Boojum. Some even claim to have seen Annie and the Boojum's descendants, that are slightly less hairy but still sharp-eyed and watchful, lurking deep in the woods, and the legend has been fully embraced by the local culture. Today, because of this, you can raise a glass to the Boojum at Boojum Brewing Co. right in Waynesville. They serve up craft beer with names that nod to local legends, giving people the chance to share their favorite Bigfoot stories over a pint. And every year since 2016, the town of Canton, North Carolina has celebrated with the Boojum Festival, a gathering of music, folklore, food, and mountain magic in honor of the creature who watches, howls, and loves in the heart of the Balsams. So, next time you're hiking in this part of the Smokies of North Carolina and you hear something distant in the trees, something that sounds a little bit like an owl, but not quite, stop and listen. You might just be hearing the last echoes of Annie and her Boojum, still calling to each other beneath the stars. Look, I know you think you know your US history. And the very first thing that happened in the proper United States was, of course, its formation, sort of our Big Bang, if you will, the signing of the Declaration of Independence on July 4th of 1776. But what if this wasn't the first time our independence was declared? What if the opening shot wasn't fired in Philadelphia, but in the backwoods of North Carolina? That's the sensational claim behind the so-called Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence, a document that some say predates Jefferson's by more than a year. According to local lore, it was signed on May 20th of 1775 in Charlotte, North Carolina, by a group of county delegates fed up with British tyranny. If true, it would mean that Americans declared their independence from Britain at least a year before it became official, not in a major city, not by a continental congress, but by settlers and patriots in what was then a southern backwater. So first, let's start with the claim. And let's be clear, the claim is bold. It's that, as I said, on May 20th of 1775, delegates from Mecklenburg County, North Carolina met in Charlotte and adopted a series of resolutions that declared themselves, I quote, free and independent of British rule. The story goes that news of the fighting at Lexington and Concord on April 19th of 1775, a battle that was among the first uprisings of militias against British soldiers, arrived in Charlotte in early May, triggering public outrage. A mass meeting was held at the courthouse, resulting in the drafting and signing of what is now known as the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence, or simply the MECDEC. The alleged document states, "We do hereby declare ourselves free and independent people," and concludes with absolved from an allegiance to the British Crown. If accurate, that would make it the first Declaration of Independence by American colonists, more than a year ahead of July 4th, 1776. North Carolina's own state flag even reflects the date. It reads May 20th, 1775. But here's the problem. No original copy of this declaration exists, which rightfully makes folks skeptical. So, given this fact, where did the story come from? Well, the first widespread mention of the mech deck came not in 1775, not in 1776, but in 1819, 44 whole years later, when Dr. Joseph McNitt Alexander, the son of one of the alleged signers, John McNitt Alexander, published a reconstructed version of the document in a Raleigh newspaper. According to Alexander, the original was lost in a fire, but his father had left behind notes and drafts. So based on memory and supposed fragments, the younger Alexander recompiled what he claimed was the original mech deck. Immediately, the claim ignited controversy, especially because the language of the document bore striking similarities to Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. So if this document was really true, who allegedly wrote it and signed it? Well, as I said, the supposed lead author of the mech deck was John McNitt Alexander, a respected local leader. He and others in the area had been active in organizing resistance to British rule. That's at least a fact, and the document was reportedly signed by 27 men, representing various militia companies and communities in Mecklenburg County. These included figures like Ephraim Brevard, often credited without solid evidence as a possible drafter, as well as Hezekiah Alexander, Adam Alexander, Waitstill Avery, and Zebulon Alexander. Also, yes, there were a lot of Alexanders. They were a prominent local family. Also, to be clear, if this document were true, they certainly had plenty of motivation to create it. But were they brave enough to pull the trigger? In early 1775, for instance, tensions between the colonists and Britain were boiling over, but most colonists, even the more radical ones, had not yet committed to independence. They were angry about taxation and imperial overreach, but they weren't quite ready to sever ties completely. Thus, the claim that a group of frontier settlers in North Carolina decided on their own to completely sever political ties with Britain more than a year ahead of Congress is pretty extraordinary. But to play devil's advocate here, Mecklenburg had a reputation as a hotbed of revolutionary fervor. Its militia was active, its Presbyterian population was deeply distrustful of monarchy, and it had organized opposition to the Stamp Act years earlier. It's plausible that local leaders passed some kind of strong resolution in May 1775, possibly even one that completely renounced British authority. But, and this is a crucial but, these 1819 memories of a 1775 document making radical claims might just be confusion, and a draft of a document being found by someone's kid. See, historians generally agree that something was written and adopted in Charlotte in May of 1775, but it was likely the Mecklenburg Resolves, not a Declaration of Independence. See, these resolves, they're factual, and they were discovered in 1838 in old newspaper archives. They were published in the South Carolina Gazette on June 13th of 1775, just weeks after the meeting. The Mecklenburg Resolves declared British laws null and void, suspended all legal authority of the king, and they called for local governance. But they didn't, and this is crucial, they did not declare independence, and were rather a radical step towards self-governance in the face of British aggression. Most historians think this is the document passed on May 31st of 1775, and not any real declaration of independence from Britain. Also, to toss a bit of drama in the mix, when the mech deck story came out in 1819, Thomas Jefferson was still alive, and he was furious. He felt it accused him of plagiarizing a local Carolina document for the National Declaration. In fact, Jefferson wrote in private letters that the whole thing smacked of fabrication, with suspiciously similar language, yet no surviving original copy. In North Carolina, however, the mech deck became a point of pride. In the decades following the Revolution, Southerners sought to assert their own contributions to independence by elevating a story in which local citizens, not elite congressmen, first declared freedom. The tale served as both regional pride and grassroots mythology. So with this story in mind, let's ask the ultimate question. Was it really written in 1775, and was it really a declaration of independence? Well, frankly, this comes down to whether you believe the folklore or not. But the most damning facts are the following. There's no original copy of the May 20th, 1775 supposed Mecklenburg Declaration. There's no contemporary references to it existing until 1819. The language appears to echo Jefferson's 1776 declaration, possibly too closely to be a coincidence, many scholars argue. The Mecklenburg Resolves of May 31st, 1775 are real and documented, and probably inspired the later recollection. Thus, historians, including those at the Library of Congress and the North Carolina Office of Archives and History, have largely concluded that the mech deck is almost certainly apocryphal, a well-intentioned patriotic fabrication or confusion that emerged decades after the fact. Thus, Mecklenburg's Declaration of Independence is probably not the original American Declaration of Independence, but at the very least, something important did happen in Charlotte in May of 1775. Whether it was a literal declaration or a bold set of resolutions, it marked a key moment in the American march towards self-rule. But maybe, just maybe, America's Big Bang didn't start in Philadelphia. Maybe it started with angry farmers in the Carolina backwoods, willing to go further than anyone else had gone before. North Carolina. I had a heck of a time here with you. Also, hey Gary, I hope you enjoyed this one, and thanks for reminding me that I still owed y'all in Sea Folks another video. Also, there's more where this came from, so if you want more stories for your state, or just more of this series in general, please drop a comment below and let me know what you want to see next. And hey, if you enjoyed the ride, hitting like and subscribing helps me get one step closer to my goal of 100,000 subs in 2025. Seriously, it's free, it's quick, and it lets YouTube know that this is the kind of content you'd like to see more of. As for what's next, I think I'm going to cover Massachusetts and then some Connecticut folklore. But after that, Maryland is going to get a part 2 as well, before we keep covering the rest of New England. Also, spooky season is coming up, so let me know what states you want me to cover haunted places in. And some fun news, I love football, and it's almost football season, so I thought I'd cover the origin of football mascots in college football and college football rivalries as bonus episodes this coming August. And finally, remember, most importantly, whether you just heard some hootin' at night in the balsams of North Carolina, or if you were paddleboarding and a submarine came up next to you bearing a red and blue crest that looks a bit like a soda brand, don't you ever forget, it's always story time.